You wake to the sound of boots on stone. It's still dark, the kind of darkness that lives inside palaces, thick and suffocating, older than memory. You don't know where you are. Not yet. But you feel the cold, stone cold, seeping through your skin, into your bones, like the palace itself is draining the warmth from your body before you even understand what's happening. The boots stop. Someone is standing over you. You try to speak, but your throat closes. Not from fear, not yet, but from instinct. The kind of instinct animals have when they sense the predator has already chosen them. Your name doesn't matter, hey. They don't ask it. They don't need to. You're poor. You're young. Your body still belongs to you. For now. Hands grip your arms. Not violent. Not kind. Efficient. Like your livestock being moved from pen to pen. And maybe that's closer to the truth than you want to believe. You're led through corridors that smell like incense and rot. The kind of rot that hides beneath perfume, beneath silk, beneath the polished marble of empires that tell themselves they are civilized. You pass other boys, some crying, some silent, some already gone behind the eyes. You recognize that look. You've seen it in your village, in the faces of men who came back from war but left something essential on the battlefield. They bring you to a chamber. It reeks of sweat and blood and something medicinal, herbs meant to dull pain. But never enough. Never enough. There's a table. There are instruments. There's a man in robes who won't meet your eyes, because if he did, he'd have to see you as human. And that's when you understand. This is not a nightmare you'll wake from. This is the transaction. Your body, your very manhood, traded for proximity to power. Survival and destruction, fused into a single moment. The blade gleams in the lamplight, and you realize something that will haunt you forever. You are about to become a ghost in your own skin. The blade approaches, and you wonder, what kind of man demands this? But let's step back from your body for a moment, back from the blade, back from the blood, and ask the question that matters most. Who was he? The man who built this system. The emperor who looked at human beings and saw only tools. He had a name. He had a childhood. Somewhere, long ago, a mother held him, sang to him, maybe, whispered hopes into his infant ear about the kind of man he'd become. He was not born a monster. That's the part that should terrify you. Monsters are easy. Monsters live in stories, in shadows, in places we can avoid if we're careful. But this man, this emperor, he was made. Shaped by a throne that demanded cruelty as tribute. Molded by a system so old, so entrenched, that no one even questioned it anymore. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a machine, and it ran on mutilation. Think about that. An entire empire, glittering with jade and gold, its poetry celebrated, its philosophy studied across continents. And beneath it all, this. Chambers where boys were carved into something less than men. Not because of madness, not because of chaos, but because of design. The eunuch system wasn't an accident of history. It was architecture, intentional, calculated, a solution to a problem that only existed because absolute power is paranoid. The emperor needed servants who could never threaten his lineage, who could never plant their own seed in the imperial garden, who could move through the women's quarters without suspicion, or rather, with a suspicion already answered by the knife. So he created a class of the mutilated, the incomplete, men who weren't quite men anymore, hovering in some terrible in-between space that society invented just to serve its cruelest needs. And the horror? The real horror? It became normal. Tradition. Something fathers did to sons to give them a future. The grotesque repackaged as opportunity. But what did it look like? The moment when opportunity revealed its true face. The room is smaller than you imagined. Somehow, you thought the place where manhood dies would be vast, a cathedral of horror, echoing with screams. But no, it's intimate, almost domestic. There's a table, a brazier glowing with coals. The smell of burning herbs, mugwort, camphor, something acrid meant to mask what's coming. But it doesn't mask anything. It only makes the air thicker, harder to breathe, like the room itself is complicit in what's about to happen. They give you something to bite down on. Leather, already worn smooth by teeth that came before yours. You can taste the fear of other boys in the grain of it. Hands hold you down. Not cruel hands. Not gentle ones. Just hands doing a job they've done 100 times before. 1,000. You're not special, hey. You're not even a person. You're a procedure. The pain, when it comes, is not what you expected. It's worse. Not because of the blade, though yes, the blade, sharp and deliberate and impossibly cold against your skin, but because of what it takes. Not just flesh, not just blood, but future. The ghost of a son you'll never hold, a daughter you'll never name, a wife you'll never touch on a summer night when the world feels kind. All of it, severed, cauterized with hot oil and prayer and the desperate hope that you won't be one of the ones who bleeds out before morning. Some do. The records don't say how many. History doesn't keep careful count of poor boys dying in palace basements. But you can guess. Out of every 300 brought in during selection night, maybe 200 survive. Maybe less. The infections come fast. Fever, rut, the kind of agony that makes you beg for the knife again, this time across your throat. They pack the wound with wax-soaked paper. They tie you down so you don't thrash and tear yourself open further. They leave you in the dark to either live or die. And honestly, they don't seem to care which. But you live. Your body, stubborn and traitorous, clings to this half-life. You wake days later, hollowed out, stitched together with thread and shame. The pain has dulled to a throb. The fever has broken. You are, technically, alive. And now you must serve him. The man who ordered this. The emperor who looked at you and saw only utility. You'll bow to him. Dress him. Stand silent in his chambers while he makes decisions that shape empires. This man who shaped you with a blade. What does loyalty look like when it's carved into your body? You inside now. The palace that devoured you has decided to keep you. You wear the robes. You learn the walk. Shuffling. Careful. The gait of a man whose body no longer moves the way it once did. You learn the silence. Oh, the silence. That's the most important lesson. Eunuchs are seen, not heard. Present, but not quite real. And yet, here's the paradox that will define the rest of your life. You are powerless. And you are powerful. You stand closer to the emperor than his own sons ever will. You dress him. You hear his private complaints, his fears whispered at dawn when the imperial mask slips. You know which concubine he favors, which minister he mistrusts, which wine he prefers when the weight of the throne becomes too much. His sons are threats. His wives are alliances. His generals are ambitions with swords. But you're safe. Muted. No lineage to build. No coup to plot. No heir to install. You can be trusted precisely because you've been made incapable of wanting the things men want. Except you do want. Good, you still want. Just differently now. You want to matter. To prove that what was taken wasn't everything. That you're still he, still useful, still something. And the emperor knows this. He's counted on it. Your dependency is his design. He built you this way, hollowed out and desperate to be filled with purpose. Around you, other eunuchs move through the same hallways, ghosts in silk. Are they your brothers? Some, maybe. Men who understand the language of shared trauma, who catch your eye and nod with a knowing that cuts deeper than words. But others, rivals, competitors for the emperor's favor, because favor is all you have left. Some will betray you for a better position. Some will poison you for a slight you don't remember giving. The palace has made you family and enemies simultaneously. You form a parallel society. Secret ranks, coded gestures, a shadow court within the court. You have power over servants, over concubines, sometimes even over ministers who need your whisper in the imperial air. But never over yourself. That was taken in a room that smelled like burning herbs. So you serve, and you smile, and you survive. But what did he actually want from you? Let's talk about desire. Not love, not romance. Desire. The kind that curdles when it has no limits, no one to say no, no boundary between thought and action. The emperor had 3,000 concubines. Maybe more. The number shifts depending on which scroll you read, which historian you trust. But the number doesn't matter. What matters is this. He wanted to be the only intact man among them. The only one. Every other male body that moved through those perfumed corridors, serving tea, carrying silk, standing guard in the inner chambers, had been carved into incompleteness. Why? Some scholars say paranoia. The terror that his bloodline might be corrupted, that a concubine might lie with a servant and bear a child that wasn't imperial. That somewhere in the palace, beneath his nose, his legacy was being stolen in the dark. Maybe. Paranoia is a reasonable answer when you're a man who trusts no one. But maybe it was something else. Something the court records don't say, because the truth was too grotesque to write down. Maybe it was the pleasure of it. Not sexual pleasure, though perhaps that too. But the deeper, darker thrill of absolute control. The erotic charge that comes from being the only complete man in a palace of fragments. From knowing that every time a eunuch bowed, every time one dressed him or served his wine, the act itself was a reminder, you are whole. They are not. You did this. Power, after all, isn't just about what you can take. It's about what you can break and still keep. There were rumors, of course. Whispers that traveled through servant quarters, through the city beyond the walls. Chambers where the emperor indulged tastes that had no name in polite society. Rituals that required the presence of the mutilated, not despite their condition but because of it. History doesn't record these things clearly. It can't, or won't. What gets written down is architecture, taxation, military campaigns, the clean facts of empire. What gets buried is this: the rooms where desire twisted into something unrecognizable, where a man with absolute power discovered that the only thing left to conquer was degradation itself. The eunuchs knew. They saw. They served in those chambers. And they said nothing. Because what could they say? To whom? With what voice? The silence protected him, as it always does. But here's the question that should haunt us. How did an entire empire allow this? But he didn't do this alone. Let's be clear about that. The emperor didn't wield the knife himself. He didn't hold the boys down. He didn't sign each individual death warrant. He didn't have to, because surrounding him, propping him up like pillars holding up a rotting temple, were ministers, advisors, scholars who could quote Confucius on virtue while drafting edicts that required the mutilation of children. Men who wrote the policies, set the quotas, formalized the bureaucracy of castration as if it were tax collection. 300 boys per selection, per year, maybe more during times of expansion when the emperor needed a larger staff. Someone calculated that number. Someone determined the acceptable loss rate. Someone created the forms. Yes, forms. Paperwork. Official documentation for the removal of a child's humanity. And the families? The fathers who brought their sons to the palace gates, who handed them over with trembling hands and desperate hope. They're complicit too. Not villains, victims maybe crushed by poverty so absolute that mutilation looked like opportunity. But still, they knew. They chose. They told themselves it was for the best. The entire court looked away. Ministers who walked past the recovery chambers and smelled the infection but said nothing. Generals who commanded armies in the emperor's name but never questioned the price of imperial service. Poets who wrote odes to the dynasty's glory while eunuchs bled out in the basement. This is how atrocity becomes normal, not through sudden violence, but through bureaucracy, through tradition, through the quiet agreement that some bodies matter less than others, that some suffering is acceptable if it serves the system. They gave the eunuchs titles, official ranks, honor positions within the court hierarchy, as if a fancy name could replace what was taken. As if calling someone Grand Supervisor of the Imperial Bedchamber made up for the fact that he'd been butchered to earn it. Language as anesthetic. Tradition as excuse. And everyone pretended not to see. But not everyone bowed. In every nightmare, there are those who refuse to sleep. Those who look at the monster and say, clearly, with full knowledge of the cost, no. They're hard to find in the records. History doesn't celebrate the ones who said no to emperors. Their names were scraped from stone, their families erased, their resistance buried beneath centuries of official silence. But they existed. The father who hid his son in a neighbor's cellar when the recruiters came, who risked execution to save what the empire wanted to take. The official who quietly resigned his post rather than sign another castration order, who walked away from power because his conscience finally became louder than his ambition. The eunuch, yes, even among the mutilated, there were rebels who smuggled letters beyond the palace walls, who wrote, in careful script on stolen paper, the truth about what happened in those chambers, who tried to warn the world, even knowing the world didn't want to listen. And the boys who chose death, not many. History records only fragments. A suicide note found in a recovery room, a body pulled from a palace well, a child who bit through his own tongue rather than survive is something less. These weren't acts of cowardice. They were refusals. Final, absolute rejections of a system that demanded their degradation. Most of this resistance failed. The families were caught. The officials were replaced. The letters were burned. The bodies were buried without ceremony. But they tried, and that matters. Because their existence, however brief, however crushed, proves something crucial. The emperor's cruelty was chosen, not inevitable, not natural, not the only way an empire could function. There were alternatives. There were voices saying so. They were simply drowned out by the machinery of power. But the machinery, like all machines built on blood, was never as stable as it appeared. Tyranny collapses under its own weight. Always. The palace that ran on mutilation started to rot from within. Slowly at first. Cracks in marble, whispers in hallways. A minister found dead under suspicious circumstances. Then faster. The kind of decay that spreads like infection, like the fever that killed so many boys in those recovery rooms. The emperor grew old. Paranoid. Sickly. He was surrounded by eunuchs. Hundreds of them. Thousands maybe. Men whose loyalty he'd purchased with a knife. But loyalty carved in a flesh isn't loyalty at all. It's resentment wearing a mask. It's survival pretending to be devotion. The eunuchs gained power. Real power. Not the symbolic kind granted by titles, but the corrupt, practical power that comes from controlling access. They decided who saw the emperor, who spoke to him, which reports reached his eyes, which truths were filtered out. They formed factions, sold influence, took bribes from ministers who needed imperial favor. Some grew obscenely wealthy. Eunuchs who'd entered the palace with nothing but trauma now lived in estates, commanded servants of their own, wielded the kind of power that would have been unthinkable if they'd kept their manhood. The irony would be funny if it weren't so dark. Meanwhile, the empire frayed. Military defeats at the borders. Generals who couldn't get resources because eunuchs blocked their petitions. Provinces that stopped sending taxes because the central authority had become a joke. A sick old man surrounded by mutilated servants playing games of power while the nation bled. Rebellion sparked. Peasant uprisings. Warlords who smelled weakness and decided to carve out their own kingdoms. The palace itself started to decay. Literally. Roofs leaked. Gardens overgrew. The smell of rot, not just metaphorical now, but real, seeped through corridors where incense could no longer mask it. The emperor walked these halls, slower each year, his body betraying him the way he'd betrayed so many bodies before. He saw the decay. How could he not? But he was trapped inside his own creation, a prisoner in the machine he'd built. His obsessions had weakened everything. The cruelty that was supposed to secure his power had hollowed it out instead. And one morning, inevitably, he didn't wake up. Every tyrant dies. The emperor, this man who wielded absolute power, who commanded armies, who carved boys into servants and called it policy, died like everyone else. In a bed, in the dark, probably in pain. The records don't agree on the cause. Some say illness, a fever that wouldn't break, the kind that turns your skin yellow and fills your lungs with fluid. Some whisper assassination, poison in wine, a pillow held over an old man's face while guards looked away. Others say, simply, his body gave up, that the weight of what he'd done finally became too much to carry. It doesn't really matter which version is true. What matters is this. He was surrounded by 300 castrated men when he took his final breath, and he died completely alone. No sons at his bedside. Maybe he had none. Maybe they existed, but hated him too much to pretend grief. No wife holding his hand. Which one would it be, anyway, among the thousands? No friend, because men with that much power don't have friends, only subjects. Just eunuchs, standing in the shadows, watching. Did they weep? Some probably did, not from love, but from habit, from the conditioning of decades spent performing loyalty. Others stood silent, faces blank, feeling something they couldn't name. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, just the numb recognition that the man who destroyed them was finally gone. The funeral was spectacular, opulent, the kind of ceremony that empires put on when they need to convince themselves and everyone watching that greatness is past, not cruelty. They dressed his corpse in silk and jade. They burned incense by the cartload. They played music that echoed through the palace like the ghosts of all those boys screaming in surgery. They buried him in a tomb fit for a god. But what was his legacy? Not philosophy, not art, not wisdom or justice or any of the things emperors dream of being remembered for. Just mutilation. Just the thousands of men walking the earth with scars where their manhood used to be. Just the system that would outlive him by centuries. So what did this all mean? Let's step back now. Out of the palace. Out of the nightmare. Into the cold air of reflection. Because here's what we need to understand. This emperor was not an aberration. He was a pattern. Castration as policy, mutilation as statecraft, the systematic destruction of human bodies to serve the machinery of power. It didn't start with him, and it didn't end with him. It appears across cultures, across centuries, across continents that never knew each other existed. Ancient Rome had eunuchs. The Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman courts, across Africa, across Asia, across the Mediterranean, wherever power concentrated absolutely, wherever one man claimed dominion over thousands, this same grotesque solution emerged. Cut them. Make them safe. Make them useful. What does that tell us? That cruelty is not a bug in the system of absolute power. It's a feature. That when human beings are given the authority to reshape other human beings for their convenience, they will. That the willingness to inflict suffering in exchange for proximity to the throne is not some ancient barbarism we've evolved beyond. It's a constant, a gravitational pull that power exerts on the vulnerable. We like to tell ourselves we're different now, more civilized, more enlightened. But are we? We still trade bodies for power. We just use different language. We don't say castration. We say opportunity cost, collateral damage, necessary sacrifice for the greater good. We build systems that chew up the poor, the young, the desperate, and we call it progress. We call it economy. We call it the way things have to be. And most of us, like those ministers, those advisors, those families who brought their sons to the palace gates, we look away. Because looking directly at the machinery is too painful. Because acknowledging our complicity is too heavy. Because it's easier to believe that the suffering we benefit from is somehow different, somehow justified, somehow not our responsibility. But the ghosts don't care what we call it. They're still there, still waiting, still asking us to acknowledge what was done in the name of order, of tradition, of keeping the system running smoothly. The palace still stands, you know. It's a tourist site now. Beautiful. Sanitized. You can walk through those same corridors where boys were led to mutilation, and you'll see polished marble, restored paintings, guided tours explaining the glorious history of the dynasty. They don't talk much about the eunuchs. Maybe a paragraph on an information placard, a footnote in the glossy brochure. But if you stand very still in the quiet moments between tour groups, you can feel it, the weight of what happened there. The presence of all those men who were never asked if they wanted to be there, who had no choice, who survived and served and died without their stories ever being told the way they deserved. 300 men, maybe more, multiplied across decades, across centuries. An ocean of suffering evaporated into history. We can't bring them back. We can't undo what was done, but we can refuse to look away. We can call it what it was. Not tradition, not necessity, not the price of civilization, but cruelty. Deliberate, systematic, normalized cruelty. And we can ask ourselves, here, in our own comfortable distance from that palace, were we still refusing to see?